Kids, how's everyone doing? I guess you guys can't answer me that question, but I hope that everyone is doing well. Hope that everyone is happy, staying safe, staying healthy. I hope that your friends and family are healthy, and I hope that you are not losing your mind during this quarantine. So, without taking up any more of your time, I'm going to get into the lecture. So today we're covering chapter 6, Sensation and Perception. I posted the PDF of this lecture on Blackboard. Oh yeah, I just wanted to point out one thing. Many of you have asked if you have done the SONA credit by participating in studies before the quarantine happened and before all the SONA studies were canceled, then those points count towards the research requirement. So if you've done if you've gotten 7 points from SONA already, you don't need to do any of the quizzes that I put up. Those are only those would only count towards extra credit for you. But if you've only done 3 studies, then you would still need 4 more points. And with that, I actually want to say that I have decided that I'm going to give everyone one extra SONA point, just extra credit. And the reason for that is I only have 6 quizzes online, of 1 point each, to fulfill the research requirements, and so that would only be if you did all those quizzes, you'd only get 6 out of the 7 points. So I'm just gonna give you the last one as extra credit. If you've already done 7 SONA studies, or if you have 7 credits already, then that 1 point will go towards extra credit. So you guys deserve it. You've been through a hard time, and yeah. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started with the lecture. Sensation and perception. We're going to talk about the basic concepts of sensation and perception. We're going to go through vision, talk about sensory and perceptual processing, and then we're going to talk about the non-visual senses like touch, smell, taste. Okay, so sensation and perception are actually parts of one continuous process. So when we talk about sensation is a bottom-up process by which the physical sensory system receives and represents stimuli at the very basic level of sensory receptors, and it works up to the brain. Whereas perception is a top-down mental process organizing and interpreting that sensory input from experience and expectations. So, what happens when there's a disconnect between sensation and perception? Bad things can happen. So one thing is called phonologia, which literally means voice blind. So you can't hear voices. So it's an inability to recognize when a voice is familiar. Okay. And there's also prosopagnosia, which is an inability to recognize or to see faces, and also the Capgras delusion. So if you guys want to watch these videos, go ahead and watch them. I won't be able to show you right now, but the PDF is attached on blackboard.com if you want to take a look. So how do we do it? How do we create meaning from the blizzard of sensory stimuli that bombards our bodies 24 hours a day? Meanwhile, in a silent, cushioned inner world, our brain floats in utter darkness. By itself, it sees nothing, it hears nothing, it feels nothing. So how does the world out there get in? Well, we have our senses. They receive sensory stimulation often by using specialized receptor cells, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And they transform that sensory stimulation into neural impulses and that neural information then gets delivered to our brain. And transduction is how that sensory stimuli gets transformed into um, neural impulses, which then get transformed to our brain, transferred to our brain. So transduction means the conversion of one form of energy into another. And so later in this chapter, we'll focus on individual sensory systems. So how do we see, hear, taste, smell, feel pain, keep our balance? In each case, one of our sensory systems receives, transforms, and delivers that information to our brain. So let's go over some basic concepts of sensation and perception. So thresholds. So at this moment, we're being struck by a ton of waves. We're getting struck by X-rays, radio waves, ultraviolet and infrared lights, even sound waves of high and low frequencies. And to all of these, we're blind and deaf. But other animals with differing needs are able to detect a world that lies beyond our own experience. So migrating birds stay on course aided by an internal magnetic compass. Bats and dolphins locate prey using sonar, bouncing echoing sound off of objects. And bees navigate on cloudy days by detecting invisible polarized light. Well, it's invisible to us, but it's not invisible to bees. And so you're driving a bus. Imagine that you're driving a bus with 12 passengers. At your first stop, 6 passengers get off. At the second stop, 3 get off. At the third stop, 2 more get off, but 3 people get on. Okay? Now, what color are the bus driver's eyes? Are you guys confused? That's because that joke got under your threshold. Haha. And the joke is that the color of the bus driver's eyes are your eyes because you're the bus driver, because I said that you're driving a bus with 12 passengers. All right, that was stupid. It was unrelated. Okay, so individual absolute thresholds vary, and so the absolute threshold, that's an important concept. So that's the minimum amount of stimulation that occurs, that's required to detect that stimuli 50% of the time. Okay, so that depends on the strength of the signal, which is bottom-up sensory information, as well as experience, expectation, motivation, alertness, which we talked about was, I'll go back to the slide, was top-down processing, right, or perception. So when a stimulus isn't at the absolute threshold, it's subliminal. So subliminal is sensory input that is below the threshold for conscious awareness. So the radio waves might be going through the air, but we're not actually consciously aware of it, right? Microwaves, right? We can stand in front of a microwave, but we don't actually feel anything, right? But don't do that. Don't stand in front of a microwave. And so, hoping to penetrate our unconscious, entrepreneurs often offer audio and video programs that they say help us lose weight, stop smoking, and improve our memories. And so, subliminal sensation is a fact. Okay, and so And remember that the absolute threshold is merely the point at which we can detect the stimulus half the time. At or slightly below this threshold, we will detect the stimulus some of the time. And so, priming, this is when you unconsciously activate associations in our mind. And so, this sets us up to perceive or remember or respond to objects or events in certain ways. And so, laboratory research actually reveals a subtle, fleeting effect of subliminal priming, but it is there. It's just subtle and fleeting. Okay, so how much stimuli does it take to have a sensation? Well, an important term here is the difference threshold, or the just noticeable difference. This is the minimum difference a person can detect between any two stimuli half the time, and it increases with stimulus with stimulus size. And so this brings us to Weber's law. This law states that for an average person to perceive a difference, two stimuli must differ by constant minimum percentage, not a constant amount, a constant minimum percentage. So if you listen to music at 40 decibels, we might detect an added 5 decibels. But if we increase the volume to 110 decibels, we probably won't detect a 5 decibel change. And so the exact proportion varies on the stimulus. For brightness, we need an 8% increase to notice the difference. For weight, it's 2%, and for tone, it's 0.3%. Okay, so sensory adaptation. So this is when our sensitivity to stimuli diminishes after being presented with that stimuli constantly. Okay, and so this helps us actually reduce background chatter, right? Because if we're able to adapt to background chatter, then we're able to focus on the task that's important to us. And this influences how the world is perceived in a personally useful way. It influences our emotions and offers an important benefit. It gives us the freedom to focus on informative changes in our environment. So changes that actually matter, we're able to focus on because we've adapted to changes, because we've adapted to stimuli that is not changing. And so I want to ask you a question. You might not know the answer, but if you're interested, you can look it up. If our senses become adapted, if our senses are able to adapt to sensory information and block it out, then why, if we stare at an object without flinching, does that object not vanish from sight? Let me repeat that. Why, if we stare at an object without flinching, does that object not vanish from sight? If it is the case that our sensory apparatus are able to adapt to sensory stimulation. You guys can look that up if you want. Okay, and so sensory adaptations even influence how we perceive emotions. So if you gaze at this angry face on the left for 20, 30 seconds and then look at the center face, an interesting thing will happen, and you can try this. The center face will actually look scared, okay? Then if you gaze at the scared face on the right for 20, 30 seconds before returning to the center face will now look angry, right? Because what happens is when we adapt to the angry face, when we stare at the angry face, we adapt to it. And so our ability to perceive an angry face almost becomes dull. And so instead, we see the opposite of angry. We see fearful. And the same thing happens when we see the fearful face, or the opposite happens. Okay? And so by creating 50-50 morph blend of an angry face and a scared face, researchers showed that our visual system adapts to a static facial expression by becoming less responsive to it. Okay? And this effect is created by our brain, okay? Not our retinas. And so through experiences, we often come to expect certain results. And those expectations may give us a perceptual set. So without the obvious cues of blue or pink, people will struggle over whether to call a new baby he or she. But told that an infant is David, so providing a schema, people, especially children, have perceived him as bigger and stronger than if the same infant was called Diana. And so some differences, it seems, exist merely in the eyes of their beholders. So I think that's pretty interesting. And so we're about to do an example. So in this example, which works really well in class, but not really when people are quarantined for the coronavirus, I would ask half the class to close their eyes, and then to the part of the class that has their eyes open, I'd show them this image. And then I would ask the people who just saw this image to close their eyes, and the other half of the class to open their eyes. And to those people, I would show this image. Okay, so now the difference, and then I would tell everyone to open their eyes, and I would show them this image. Okay, and so what happens here is that the people who looked at this image of this old lady, would see an old lady in this image. However, people who saw this image, the picture of a young lady, when they look at this image, they would see a young lady. Even though the image has both an image of a young lady and an old lady. So you can try this at home if you want. I hope I didn't ruin it for you by doing it this way. It's kind of, I'm not used to teaching online, so I hope I'm doing a good job. And so the reason why I did this example is to show you that kind of like what determines our perceptual set, and that through experience, so to top-down information, we form concepts and schemas that organize and interpret unfamiliar information. So it's not just the bottom-up sensory information that's determining what we see, but it's also our top-down perceptual sets that influence the bottom-up sensory information. Okay, both of them work together to produce what we see. Okay, we also have context effects. So a given stimulus may trigger different perceptions, partly because of differing perceptual sets, but also because of the immediate context. So, for example, Westerners for whom corners and box-like architectures were more common were more likely to perceive this family as being indoors with the woman sitting under a window. Okay? But when East Africans were questioned, they said that the woman was balancing a metal box or can on her head, and the family was sitting under a tree outside. Isn't that really interesting? So the context that we grew up in influences what we see in this image. Okay, so we're going to talk about vision now. Okay, so our eyes receive light energy and transduce or transform it into neural messages that our brain then processes into what we consciously see. How does such a taken for granted yet extraordinary thing happen? When you look at a bright red tulip, the stimuli striking your eyes are not particles of the color red, but pulses of electromagnetic energy. It's the height of the wave, and it corresponds to how bright the color is. Okay, so the larger the amplitude, the brighter the color, and the smaller the amplitude, the duller the color. Okay, and so, sensory and perceptual processing and vision. So what we see as light is actually only a thin slice of this broad spectrum of electromagnetic energy, and the portion of electromagnetic energy that's visible to humans extends from blue violet to red light wavelengths, whereas other organisms can experience different portions of the electromagnetic spectrum, but we can't. And so, all right, getting into the eye, getting into the biology of the eye. So light rays that are reflected from a candle pass through the cornea, the pupil, and the lens. And the pupil is a small adjustable opening, and the iris is the colored muscle that dilates or constricts. So dilate means get bigger, constrict means get smaller, in response to a number of different things like light or being attracted to someone, etc. And the curve and the thickness of the lens then change to bring nearby or distant objects into focus on the retina. Okay, and this is called, the changing of the thickness of the lens is called accommodation. So rays from the top of the candle strike the bottom of the retina, and those from the left side of the candle strike the right side of the retina. So the candle's image appears upside down and reversed. So that kind of begs the question of, why don't we actually see the world upside down? And that's a question that I would ask you guys if you were here. But the answer is that the retina doesn't actually see a whole image. Rather, its millions of receptor cells are converting particles of light energy into neural impulses and forward those to the brain. There, the impulses are reassembled into a perceived upright seeming image. And so let's follow light energy particle after it's entered the eye. It then threads its way through the cornea, where it gets filtered by the lens and then reaches the retina, which we talked about on the previous slide. And then this light energy hits the buried rods and cone receptors, causing a chemical reaction, which then activates nearby bipolar cells, which in turn activate ganglion cells. So ganglion cells, axons, actually twine together to form something called the optic nerve, which then feeds information to the thalamus and then redistributes the information received by the eyes. And there's a small price to pay for the optic nerve, where the optic nerve leaves the eye, actually has no receptors, and is a blind spot. So if you've ever heard of the blind spot, this is why we have one, because this is where the optic nerve leaves the eye. Okay, so the brain actually fills in the gap here with other information. Okay, so let's talk more specifically about rods and cones. Rods and cones differ in where they're found and what they do. So rods detect blacks, whites, and grays that are necessary for peripheral and twilight vision. So when you enter a darkened room, your eyes adapt, your pupils dilate so they get bigger to allow more light to reach your retina. But it typically takes 20 minutes or more for your eyes to fully adapt. And that period of dark adaptation, 20 minutes or so, actually matches the average natural twilight transition between the sun setting and darkness. And cones are clustered near the center of the retina, in the fovea, so that's the center of the retina. And they detect fine detail and allow color vision. And many cones are so sensitive to light that they actually transmit their message to a single bipolar cell. There's a 1-to-1 ratio between cones and bipolar cells. So, summary. After processing by our retina's nearly 130 million receptor rods and cones, information travels again to your bipolar cells. From there, it moves to your eye's million or so ganglion cells, and through their axons, making up the optic nerve to your brain. After a momentary stop off in the thalamus, the information then travels to your visual cortex. This is new information now. And any given retinal area relays this information to corresponding location in your visual cortex, in the occipital lobe in the back of your brain. And so, interestingly, if you gently rub the right side of your right eyelid with your fingertip, you'll notice a patch of light to the left moving as your finger moves. So why do you see the light, and why at the left? This happens because your retinal cells are so responsive that even pressure triggers them. But your brain interprets this firing of retinal cells as light. Moreover, interprets the light as coming from the left, the normal direction of light that would activate the right side of the retina. Pretty cool, right? Okay. So let me ask you a question. If no one sees the tomato, is it red? Well, first, the tomato is everything but red because it's reflecting the long wavelengths of red. It's absorbing everything but red, and that red is being reflected and is why you see the tomato as red. Second, the tomato's color is our mental construction. Interestingly, our just noticeable difference for color is so low that we can differentiate 1 million different colors, unless you're 1 in 50 people who have color deficiencies. If anyone here is colorblind, it's more likely that you're a male because color blindness defect is sex linked, and it has to do with our chromosomes. The fact that men have 2 X chromosomes. I'm sorry, women have 2 X chromosomes, but men have an X and a Y, and so that the color blindness gene comes from the Y chromosome. And so this guy Helmholtz knew that any color can be created by combinations of different amounts of light waves of 3 primary colors: red, green, and blue. And so knowing this, Young and Van Helmholtz formed a hypothesis that the eye must have 3 corresponding types of color receptors: red, green, and blue. And color people aren't really blind to color, but are usually missing red or green cones, or both, giving them chromatic or dichromatic vision. But trichromatic theory didn't explain why people blind to red and green can still see yellow. And so this guy named Herring found a clue in after images. So if you stare at a green square for a while and then look at a white sheet of paper, you'll see red, green's opponent color. And so if you literally stare at that flag for like 20 or 30 seconds and then stare at the dot, it'll be really interesting what you see. And so Herring, based on this, formed another hypothesis that there must be 2 additional color processes, one responsible for red versus green perception, and one responsible for blue versus yellow perception. By staring at green, we tire out our green response. When we then stare at white, which contains all colors including red, only the red part of the green-red pairing will fire normally, and so you see its opponent color. Okay, and so let's talk about information processing in the eye and the brain. We'll talk about this a little bit. So the brain uses feature detection. This involves nerve cells in the brain that respond to specific features of the stimulus, such as shape, angle, and movement. And Hubel and Wiesel won a Nobel Prize for their work on feature detectors. and they found that the brain deconstructs and reassembles visual images based on those specific features of shape, angle, or movement. And so one example is the fusiform face area we talked about last week. So if you're stimulating this area, you might spontaneously see faces. If this region were damaged, you might recognize other forms and objects, but you wouldn't recognize faces. And so to analyze a visual scene, the brain divides it into sub-dimensions like motion, form, depth, color, and works on each aspect simultaneously. But how does the brain do this? The answer to that is actually can't tell you. It's a mystery, the holy grail of vision research. And there's a video on here that I want you guys to watch. We now know that the mind sees color and shape, but how do we organize them into meaningful perceptions? Well, Gestalt psychologists propose principles used to organize sensations into perception. And some of these, and we're going to talk about some of these, so form perception, depth perception, perceptual constancy. As we look straight ahead, we cannot separate the perceived scene into our left and right fields of view. It is at every moment one whole, seamless scene, and our conscious perception is an integrated whole. So, for example, how do we organize and interpret shapes and colors into meaningful perceptions? We'll look at this Necker cube and tell me, what do you see? Do you see circles with white lines, or do you see a cube? Interestingly, if you stare at the cube, you may notice that it reverses location, moving the tiny X in the center from the front edge to the back. At times, the cube may seem to float in front of the page with circles behind it, but at other times, the circle may become holes in the page through which the cube appears, as though it were floating behind the page. And so there's far more to a perception that meets the eye, and the whole may exceed the sum of its parts. Okay, and so we have this, in the eye-brain system, our first perceptual task is to perceive any object, the figure, as distinct from its surroundings, the ground. And so how do we know where one object begins and another ends? Well, the figure ground illusion, our figure ground system is able to do this by organizing the visual fields into objects that stand out from their surroundings. So in this picture, you either see the arrows as the figures or the firefighters as the figures. And so, having discriminated figure from ground, we must also organize the figure into meaningful form. So, grouping is our perceptual tendency to organize stimuli into meaningful groups. So proximity is when we group nearby figures together. So in this image to the left, we do not see 6 separate lines, but we see 3 sets of 2 lines. Continuity is when we perceive a smooth, continuous pattern rather than discontinuous ones. So this pattern could be a series of alternating semicircles, but we perceive it as 2 continuous lines, one wavy and one straight. Closure is when we fill in gaps to create a complete whole object. Thus, we assume that the circles on the left are complete but partially blocked by the illusory triangle. Such principles usually help us construct reality. Sometimes, however, they lead us astray. So, this image, for example, if you stare at it for long enough, you'll notice that it doesn't make any sense. Alright, so although the images that strike the retina are two-dimensional, depth perception allows us to create mental images of objects in 3 dimensions and to judge distance. I'll give you guys a few seconds to read the slide. An awesome demonstration of this is something called the visual cliff. And so the depth cue here was the pattern on the floor. And Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk devised a miniature cliff with a glass-covered drop-off to determine whether crawling infants and newborn animals can actually perceive depth. And they found that even when coaxed, infants are reluctant to venture onto the glass over the hill. So, had the infants learned to perceive depth? Learning seems to be part of the answer because crawling, no matter when it begins, seems to increase infants' awareness of heights. And so, as infants become mobile, their experience leads them to fear heights. And so, how do we do it? How do we transform two-dimensional retinal images into a single 3-dimensional perception? So, I'm going to have you guys try something if you want. You don't have to. I'll never know if you don't. Or I might. No, I won't. So with both eyes open, hold 2 pens or pencils in front of you and touch their tips together. Now do this with one eye closed. Okay, you'll see that it's harder. That's because binocular cues aid in judging the distance of nearby objects. So 2 eyes are better than 1. They help us be able to tell depth. And this happens because of retinal disparity. Our eyes are 2.5 inches apart, so our retinas receive slightly different images of the world. And so by comparing images from 2 eyes, the brain is able to compute distance, and the greater the disparity or the distance between the 2 images, the closer the object is. But retinal disparity can differentiate between 1 and 10 feet away, but not between 10 and 100 feet away. So how do we judge whether a person is 10 or 100 meters away? Retinal disparity won't help us here, because there won't be much of a difference between the images cast on our right and our left retinas. For example, if you look at the moon, how far away it is, and you look at it by closing your left and right eyes, it won't move, right? Because the moon is too far away. At such distances, we depend on monocular cues. So here are some examples of monocular cues. Light and shadow. So shading produces a sense of depth consistent with their assumption that light comes from above. And so if you invert this illustration, the holes will become the hills. So I'll do it for you. I'll invert it. Crazy, right? The holes are still the hills. Interposition is when one object partially blocks our view of another, and so we perceive that object as closer. And so here we know that even if these deer were really far away, since we can see the interposition, because this deer is blocking this deer's view, we perceive this deer as closer. And that's called interposition. And so our eye's next task, or our eye brain's next task, is to recognize objects without being deceived by changes in their color, brightness, shape, or size. A top-down process called perceptual constancy. So regardless of the viewing angle, distance, and illumination, we're able to identify people and things in less time than it takes to draw a breath, which is what I just did. So we have no trouble seeing these discs as blue, Nor does knowing the truth that these discs are identically colored diminish our perception that they are quite different, right? Because we construct our perceptions, we can simultaneously accept alternative object and subjective realities. Our perception of the color and brightness of a wall or of a streak of paint on a canvas is determined not just by the paint in the can, but by the surrounding colors. And so the take home lesson is that comparisons govern our perceptions. I'll let you guys kind of look at the slide for a little bit longer. So shape constancy is our perception of a form of familiar objects is constant even when retinas receive changing images. Size constancy is the perception that objects are a constant size even when distance from them varies. So comparison governs our perception. So size constancy, we assume a car is large enough to carry people even when we see its tiny image from 2 blocks away, right? So even when if a car looks tiny because we're looking at it from far away, we still know that it's big and that it can fit people in it. So there's a video here for you guys to watch. Please watch it. And so the effective sensory restriction on infant cats, monkeys, and human suggests that there's a critical period for normal sensory and perceptual development. And so if we don't get stimulation during this critical period, then normal connections that allow us to see do not develop. In both humans and animals, similar sensory restrictions later in life do not do no permanent harm. And so when researchers cover the eye of an adult animal for several months, his vision will be unaffected after the eye patch is removed. So perceptual adaptation is the ability to adjust to an artificially displaced or inverted visual field. So when we're given a new pair of glasses, we might initially feel slightly disoriented, even dizzy. But within a day or two, we adjust. But humans can adjust to things that are even more extreme. So, for example, psychologist George Stratton in 1896 experienced this. He invented and for 8 days wore this optical headgear that flipped left to right and up to down, making him the first person to experience a right side up retinal image while standing upright. So the ground was up and the sky was down. Eating was nearly impossible. At first he became nauseated and depressed, but he persisted. And by the 8th day he could comfortably reach for an object in the right direction and walk around without bumping into things. And then when Stratton finally removed the headgear, he readapted quickly and everything looked crazy and then normal again. And so that's actually not George Stratton in the photo. The name of the person in the photo is Hubert Dolezal, the guy in the photo. All right, so let's talk about hearing. So audition is the sense or act of hearing. So most of us can hear a wide range of sounds, and the ones we hear best are those in the range of the human voice. So with normal hearing, we're remarkably sensitive to faint sounds, such as a child's whimper. If our eyes were much more sensitive, we would hear a constant hiss from the movement of air molecules. And our distant ancestors' survival depended on this keen hearing when hunting or being hunted. We're also remarkably attuned to sound variations. Among thousands of possible human voices, we easily recognize a friend on the phone from the moment he says hi. And here are some key terms. So amplitude, That's the height of a wave. It determines the loudness in sound waves, whereas it determined brightness in color determines loudness in sound waves. So low frequency, I'm sorry, and length, that's the frequency of the wave, which determines the pitch. So low frequency equals long wavelength, which equals low pitch. And sound is actually measured in decibels. So 0 decibels is the absolute threshold, not the absence of sound, just less than what we can hear. And every 10 decibels corresponds to a 10-fold increase in sound intensity. Thus, normal conversation, 60 decibels, is 10,000 times more intense than a 20 decibel whisper. And so 0 decibels is the absolute threshold, not the absence of sound, just less than what we can hear. And 60 decibels is normal conversation, and 85 decibels, prolonged exposure can give us, can cause us hearing loss. Sorry, they had the wrong slide up there. So here what I meant to show you is that how the length of the wave determines the frequency, which determines how high or low pitch the sound is. So short wavelength occurs with high pitch sounds, whereas the low wavelengths cause low pitch sounds. And then amplitudes have to do with the loudness of the sound. So great amplitudes lead to loud sounds, and small amplitudes lead to soft sounds. And so here's where I meant to talk about decibels. So decibels, 0 decibels is the absolute threshold, so just less than what we can hear, right? Whereas whispers around 20 decibels, normal conversation around 60 decibels, and then higher than 85 decibels when we start is what can cause us hearing loss. So there's a lot of sounds, everyday sounds that can cause hearing loss, like subway, train at 20 feet, jet plane, thunder, or being at a rock band. I love being a rock band. I love them. I think my hearing is still good, to be honest. Okay, so how do we hear though? So sound waves enter the visible outer ear and then channel the wave through the auditory canal to the eardrum. So it's a tight membrane causing the eardrum to vibrate. And then in the middle ear, a piston made up of 3 tiny bones, which we call the hammer, anvil, and the stirrup, picks up the vibrations and then transmits them to the cochlea, which is a snail-shaped tube in the inner ear. The incoming vibrations cause the cochlea's membrane, so the oval window, to vibrate, and jostling the fluid then fills the tube. This motion causes ripples in the basilar membrane, bending the hair cells lining the surface. And it's this hair cell movement that triggers impulses in the adjacent nerve cells. And then axons of those cells converge to form the auditory nerve, which sends neural messages via the thalamus to the auditory cortex in the brain's temporal lobe. So, probably went through that pretty fast. I was going to repeat what I said, but you can also just play the video back, or we're going to do it again. So, this is actually a picture. So, the sound waves enter the visible outer ear, where my cursor is, and then channels the waves through the auditory canal over here to the eardrum, which is this tight membrane, and causing it to vibrate. So there's actually a bigger picture down here. I'm gonna zoom in on this. So you see where the eardrum is? Over here. And then so in the middle ear, this is the middle ear, this piston made up of 3 tiny bones, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup picks up these vibrations and transmits them to the cochlea, this thing, the snail-shaped tube in the inner ear. And the incoming vibrations cause the cochlear membrane, the oval window right over here, to vibrate. And what that does is it jostles the fluid inside the tube, and this motion causes ripples in the basilar membranes. The basilar membrane is this pink thing, okay, and that bends the hair cells, aligning its surface. You see these hair cells? You have to really zoom in, and that hair cell movement triggers impulses in these adjacent nerve cells, and then axons of those nerve cells combine to form the auditory nerve. The auditory nerve, which then sends neural messages via the thalamus to the auditory cortex in the brain's temporal lobe. I'll let you guys stare at this for a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about hearing loss. So across the world, 360 million people are challenged by hearing loss. And damage to the cochlear hair cell receptors or their associated nerves can cause sensory neural hearing loss or nerve deafness. Occasionally, disease damages these receptors, but more often, the culprits are biological changes linked with heredity, aging, and prolonged exposure to ear-splitting noise or music. So ringing in our ears after exposure to loud sounds indicates that we've been bad to our hair cells. It is hearing's equivalent to bleeding. And sensory neural hearing loss is more common than conduction hearing loss, which is caused by damage to the mechanical system that conducts the sound waves to the cochlea. So, based on what we just learned about what we hear, how do we detect loudness? This is a question that I ask you guys. Because I can, I'm just going to give you the answer. So your brain interprets loudness from the number of activated hair cells. So this is similar to the number of neurons firing. So if a hair cell loses sensitivity to soft sounds, it may still respond to loud sounds. This is why hearing aids don't amplify all sounds, but compress sound. So harder to hear sounds are amplified more than loud sounds. And there are two theories about how we perceive pitch. There's Helmholtz's place theory. So we hear different pitches because different sound waves trigger activity different places in the cochlea's basilar membrane. So this best explains how we hear high-pitched sounds. But we also have frequency theory, which explains how we hear low-pitched sounds. And so the whole basilar membrane vibrates with the incoming sound waves, which triggers neural impulses to the brain at the same rate of the sound wave. And so if the sound has a frequency of 100 waves per second, then 100 pulses per second travel up to the auditory nerve. But how do we send sounds with frequencies above 1,000 waves per second? Well, that's where Volley theory comes in. Volley theory says that neural cells alternate firing so they can achieve a combined frequency above 1,000 waves per second. All right. So now let me ask you this. Why don't we just have one ear, like a really big one on our forehead? Why do we have two ears? Well, aside from looking stupid, two ears are better than one because sound waves will be able to strike one ear sooner and more intensely than another. And this allows us to compute the location of a sound. And so people who lose all hearing in one ear often have difficulty locating sounds. Okay, so let's talk about touch. So right from the start, touch aids our development. So think of Harry Harlow and his monkeys. When the monkeys could touch the cloth, they enjoyed it and it helped them develop. So sense of touch is actually a mix of four distinct skin senses: pressure, warmth, um, cold, and pain. Okay. And if you guys were here, I would ask you um, what the worst pain you ever felt was. But you guys aren't. So I'm just going to talk more about touch. So touch sensations involve more than tactile stimulation. However, a self-administered tickle produces less somatosensory cortex activation than does the same tickle from something or someone else. Likewise, a sensual leg caress evokes a different somatosensory response when a heterosexual man believes it's coming from an attractive woman rather than a man, right? So we have this top-down perceptual influence of bottom-up sensory information. And sensory receptors send information to the spinal cord, which then sends the information to the brain, interpreting as pain. Be thankful for occasional pain. Pain is your body's way of telling you something's gone wrong. By drawing your attention to a burn or a break or a sprain, pain orders you to change your behavior. So it tells you literally, stay off that turned ankle. And rare people born without the ability to feel pain may experience severe injury or even death before early adulthood. And so, what is pain? Our pain experiences vary widely. So, women are more sensitive to pain than men, but also tend to have a higher tolerance for it. Okay. And so we have this biological influence of pain, that the brain can create pain without even any external stimuli, right? So an example of this is phantom limb syndrome. But we also have a psychological influence. So are we attending to the pain? Our expectations about pain. And we also have the social cultural influence. So the presence of other people can make us less scared of pain. We can feel other people's pain when we watch them experience pain, and we also have cultural expectations for what things cause pain. And so all these things combine in order to create our personal experience of pain. So it's a social phenomenon. Oh, right, the non-visual senses. Another one, taste. And so taste in a lot of ways is similar to touch. It's often an interaction of sensory information. One sense may influence another. So smell plus texture plus taste equals flavor. And so the basic tastes are sweet, salty, sour, and bitter. And so these actually have survival functions, which is probably why we evolved to have these tastes. So sweet indicates an energy source. Salty indicates sodium, which is essential for physiological processes. Sour tells us that something is potentially toxic, and bitter corresponds to a poison. And so, as investigators search for specialized nerve fibers for the taste sensation, for the four taste sensations, they end up encountering a receptor for what we now know is a fifth, the savory, meaty taste of umami, best experienced as the flavor enhancer monosodium glutamate, or MSG. So this is when you see signs to restaurants say no MSG added. That's what we're talking about, monosodium glutamate. It's like this savory taste sensation. Okay, and so let's talk about taste in a chemical way. So um, we have these bumps on our tongue, right? And inside each bump on the top and sides of our tongue are 200 taste buds. And inside each bud is a pore with 50 to 100 taste receptors. And each receptor reacts to different types of food molecules and sends messages to the brain. So taste receptors actually reproduce themselves every week or so. So if you burn your tongue with hot food, it hardly matters. However, as you grow older, the number of taste buds decreases, and so does your taste sensitivity. Smoking or alcohol use can accelerate these declines. And as essential as taste buds are, there's more to taste than meets the tongue. Expectations can also influence taste. So being told that a wine costs $90 rather than its real $10 price makes it taste better and triggers more activity in the brain that responds to pleasant experiences. Okay. So now we're going to talk about smell. So if you are to smell a flower, airborne molecules of its fragrance must reach receptors at the top of your nose. And sniffing swirls air up to the receptors, enhancing the aroma. The receptor cells then send messages to the brain's olfactory bulbs and onward to the temporal lobe's primary smell cortex and to parts of the limbic system involved in memory and emotion. So smell is pretty intimate. When you inhale something of whoever, you're inhaling part of that thing when you smell. It's literally bits and pieces of whatever you're smelling are entering your nose, and touching your olfactory bulb. And so, different combinations of receptors identify different smells. So, our brain circuitry helps explain an odor's power to evoke feelings, memories, and behaviors. So a hotline runs between the brain area that receives information from the nose and the brain center is associated with emotions and memories. So despite our skill at discriminating scents, we aren't very good at describing them. So which is easier, describing the sound of coffee brewing or the aroma of coffee? For most people, it's the sound, and describing the smell is more difficult. And I have a video for you guys to see. Okay. I'm going to stop here. There are a few more slides left, but they aren't very important, and I'll let you guys go through these on your own. One of them is just summarizing what we went through. So, thank you guys for listening. Sorry that everything has been so crazy. I'll let you guys send me emails if you have any questions. And hope everyone's doing well.